while that's revealed to us. So they overlap a bit. Natural and revealed law of conscience is the act of applying universal principles, things we know to be true, to real-life situations. And his definition of conscience is the application of knowledge to activity. So conscience isn't in and of itself right or wrong. It directs us to what is right or wrong. It's merely a signpost. That's it. There are certain kinds of conscience that we must have. And it's very interesting to know this. Kinds of conscience. So we have true conscience if the judgments we have are true. And this is the quality of our conscience. And if the judgments are false, we have a false conscience. That sounds pretty obvious, but the importance and significance of that is coming. There's a lax conscience, fails to see where sins exist. There's a scrupulous conscience, which sees sins everywhere. And those are two extremes we must avoid. There's a certain conscience, which is correct in its judgment, and there's a doubtful conscience. And that it's important to know about a doubtful conscience. We are never allowed to act if our conscience is in doubt. Our conscience has been formed and is still being formed by God and by the things around us. So it's important that we never act on a doubtful conscience. Now, this true conscience, it is very important. It's necessary in order to get to heaven. A necessary conscience. A person must always act in accord with conscience. We seek authority from above, from around us, but we have to know it's true before we act on it. If we cannot get to a particular authority before we act, then we are just obliged to act on our own will, what we see as the right thing to do at the moment. But on our part, we must make every effort in order to form a true conscience. So sometimes, if we don't know what to do in a certain situation, that's not our fault. But there are times when it is, because we failed to learn something beforehand. And that's why your efforts to all come to the Catechism class, your efforts to listen to sermons on Sunday, those are all little seeds that you never know when they're going to sprout. But you will need them sometime. And God puts that in your path for a certain reason. The 8 North American martyrs went to America, theology experts. You have to have at least a master's, if not a doctorate, in moral theology, because you will be attacked in every way, shape, or form by these natives, and you will be challenged every single moment of your life. And you have to be able to hold true to your conscience and form the conscience of the natives in front of you. So it's a very important tool that they brought over with them, that moral theology. Now, in order to be responsible for the actions that we have, to be responsible, we must have those conditions laid out on page 407. We must have the freedom to act. We must have the knowledge of what we're doing, meaning an infant or someone insane isn't morally responsible, so we must know what we're doing. And we must be willing to act. It can't be done under coercion. So 3 things for moral responsibility, just important things to keep in mind, because if those aren't there, we aren't morally responsible for the virtue or the vice that we are practicing. Now, the elements of a good act, and this is the first thing I think that would make a good examination of conscience. What are the elements of a good act? Well, first of all, what is the basic rule for morality? Our Lord explains it to us in his life and in his teachings, but on page 408 it's simply do good and avoid evil. Now that's very simple, but what does that lead to? It leads to liberty, true liberty. Ironically, we were talking about the Enlightenment this morning. That's the other type of liberty, false liberty. But true liberty comes from the freedom of everyone following order. Order comes from every obedience to law. So you follow law, you bring order. You bring order, you gain freedom, liberty. So those are important for this doing good and avoiding evil actually brings about true liberty in society. So it's each one of our actions, orderly actions, is significant. Rights can only exist if people correspond to the duties that are given to them and are given to others. And a true just law will defend the rights of the individual. For, and that's what our actions should all tend to. Now, the elements of a good act. I just want to point out a couple things that will clarify. The outline is on page 409, but there's a couple of points I would like to clarify about the elements of a good, naturally good, moral act. Human acts are moral because they have a certain goodness or evilness about them. They can go one way or the other. Very few things we do are neutral. The morality of acts is defined by the choices that one makes in accordance with authentic good, based on the eternal law that has a desire for God as our end goal. Morality is defined by the choice of one made in accordance with our authentic good. So people can say, oh, that was great, that was good. It's only good if it orders us to our authentic good. That's the only type of good that matters. And it is based on an eternal law that has a desire for God, our end goal. That was from the encyclical Veritas Splendor, written by John Paul II. And it is, I think it makes it easier for us to grasp what the book will say next. So any morally good act, what they mean by a good moral act is not just, oh, that was good, is anything that orders us to our final end. That's good. So it has to be good in its nature. Some acts we know are good in their nature. And these all, and some acts are good in their purpose. And there's an interesting example your book has where it says some of these things, let's take the two examples on the right, top and bottom. The family loving each other is an example of a naturally good act. It's good by nature. But these two, we wouldn't doubt or judge, but internally, are the people attending Mass, is the person giving alms to the poor person, is that being done out of love for God and neighbor, or is it being done to show off to other people how good we try to be? Again, that intention matters, and we'll get to intention in a moment from another source. It also has to be good in its circumstances. So the example your book gives, eating is wonderful. It's actually necessary. But eating meat on Friday, especially during Lent, is sinful. Unless we make up in the new dispensation, there are slight variations. But that's the idea, where some things are good as long as we do them in the right time, or as your book says, in the right place. The way we dress in certain places is different, and it's not necessarily bad unless it's wrong for that place. The time we do it means that we take to do it, and in the manner that we do it. So we won't get too specific now. We're going to get to the virtues later, but those are very important. And those are important for a morally good act, but they actually don't become meritorious until we have the ways for an act to become supernaturally meritorious. So those three are important. They have to be good in nature, intention, and circumstance, as Aquinas points out. But they also have to be good to be meritorious. They must be good by being performed in the state of grace. Nothing is meritorious for someone who acts very well, but in the state of mortal sin. And they must be directed by a supernatural motive. So on page 410, they give us three conditions or three reasons to be in the state of grace. The sanctifying grace, the state of grace, causes God to dwell in our soul. It's a share in the merits of Christ and gives us the power to act supernaturally. As Christ said at the Last Supper, if we commit a mortal sin, we're cut off from the vine, and we're ready to be thrown into the fire and burned. We have no life in us spiritually. So it's very important to be in the state of grace. And supernatural motive. What is a supernatural motive? A supernatural motive is acting out of a love for God. Performing something out of a love for God. And it could be through faith, believing that God is who He is, even if love may be a little weakened at the time. Acting out of faith is supernatural. Acting out of love for God is also supernatural. So those two matter. And how do we do that? Our morning offering is that important. That's how important that is. So throughout the day, hopefully we can say some aspirations, lift our mind and soul to God. Daily prayer we'll get to later in this talk. But that purity of intention through our morning offering and through our little prayers throughout the day, it sanctifies everything we do. It's what's called the Midas touch for our daily actions. So I want to tell you a few very practical things, and I think very powerful ways to form that pure intention from the moral theologian himself, St. Alphonsus. And he writes, this is mostly for priests and religious, but I think it's applicable to all of us. The 4 ways that we can form a pure intention of pleasing God, or 4 ways we know that we have a pure intention. First, you're not disturbed when your projects are unsuccessful, but you retain the same composure as if you had succeeded. In this way, you are working for God alone. You know that He is not concerned with the outcome of your work, but only whether you have undertaken it with the purpose of pleasing Him. 2, you are as pleased with the good which is worked by means of others as if it had been achieved by you. 3rd, you do not long for one position rather than another, but are content with whatever providence has arranged for you. You seek to please God in whatever it is you're doing. And 4th, you do not look for approval or gratitude because of good actions. If you are appreciated or ill-treated, you still retain that same inner peace. That's how we know. We can sense it inside. We still have peace after we have done that. Any self-seeking, if we do an amazing job on something, any self-seeking or satisfaction or vainglory, seeking for our own efforts, actually only merits punishment, no reward. And he gives 3 ways that those are signs to know, 3 ways that our intention can be good. And this is for his direction to religious. First, when we perform an act in order to obtain from God temporal goods, that is fine, as long as we pray for them with the right intention of pleasing God with those temporal goods. It is a pure intention. Second, we do an act in order to make satisfaction to divine justice, or to increase our merits in heaven, help souls in purgatory. So that's the second way our intention can be pure. And thirdly, and most perfectly of all, when we seek only to please God. So, those are little guideposts to tell us if our intention, the way an act can be meritorious, is actually present in our souls when we do that, when we act. All right, now, these intentions are significant in the way we act. These 2 guideposts that we have, these guideposts for laws, are now applicable to our daily life in the virtues. We use these guideposts to practice. Now, we just learned about a meritoriously good act. A virtue is a good act that is habitual. We don't have the virtue of anything if it's not habitual. These charts that follow are a great examination of conscience. So, the first on page 413, we have a synopsis of the rule of a Christian life. That's always a good word to look out for as a teacher and student, a synopsis. It means it's shorter and it has everything you need. So this synopsis on page 413 has the 7 infused virtues shown on the board here. There are 2 roads we can follow to heaven. There's the road of law, the lower road, and there's the road of love, the higher road. We're going to cover the road of love first, and the road of law, the first 3 commandments, will be at the end. But Christ said that the basic road to loving God is shown on page 413 with what's called the Great Commandment. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with thy whole heart, with thy whole soul, with thy whole mind, with thy whole strength, and love thy neighbor as thyself. It doesn't have strength in there, but Mark and Luke's version does. So the those 4 things: heart, soul, mind, and strength. We love God and then love our neighbor as ourselves for the love of God. That's the basic rule for this law of love that we're trying to follow in order to please God. That synopsis that we see there, we'll cover in the next few pages. So if you turn to the chart on page 414 to 415, I will just point a few things out to summarize some of these virtues. If you want to look at page 413 later, that is another good synopsis, but we're going to use that chart as a little easier to use. Remember, these are habits. So, what is faith? We accept and firmly believe. I'm not going to read the exact definitions. I'm just going to point them out so you can read both. We accept and firmly believe all that God has revealed because the church teaches it. So if we live by that, that's faith. If we live by hope, we have a great confidence in God, trust in His goodness, trust that He's going to give us the means to heaven, trust that He's true to His promises. If we live that, we have the virtue of hope. Charity, supernatural love of God and love of neighbor above all things. Prudence, we intelligently, prudently, and humbly plan and live our lives, realizing who God is and realizing who we are. We realize that difference and our trust in God. We actually practice the virtue of prudence. Being fair, honest, and giving all men their due is the virtue of justice. Be courageous and persevering and good, never giving in nor giving up to do what is right. Okay, that's the virtue of fortitude. And lastly, temperance, controlling our senses, our appetites, and our tendencies. Very challenging to do, but if we do that consistently, that is a virtue. And that's what we're striving for. Now, if we look on that chart there are some great tips, although that's just a basic summary. Actually, I've read from page 413, but you can now gather in both from 414 and the chart I just read. But for faith in hope and charity and also prudence, they have numbers under them that tell you the results of living like those with those virtues in your life. It enlightens our faith, enlightens our minds, strengthens our convictions, source of comfort, renders works meritorious. There's like, yes, I want that. Yes, I want that. Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great. Cool. So, but it all comes from practicing that virtue of faith, even in the smallest degree. It grows. Hope detaches us from earthly goods if we practice this trust in God. Efficacy in our prayer by trusting in God. Certainty of success. Those sound really attractive. And charity unites us to God, comprises all the virtues. Anytime we do practice a virtue of charity, we do gain all virtues. Any act of charity. So those are great little reminders to have. What faith, hope, and charity can actually do if we practice each one a little bit. And then they also have, for the moral virtues have little sub-virtues underneath them. They all fall under, most virtues fall under these 7 virtues on the board here. And we're not going to go through all of them. But if you notice that there are some here, we should all notice some of them, that, I need to work on that. Those could use a little bit of work. Well, if you practice that, look at the definition of that virtue, of that header virtue, one of those 7 virtues. Say, so if I practice that one, it strengthens my weakness here. They're all connected. So that is, I'm going to emphasize this now and emphasize it at the end too. And I love this point that anytime you strengthen one particular virtue, you increase sanctifying grace and you increase all the virtues. So this is a great examination of conscience here. You can find those defined. There's a great talk on all of the virtues by Father Ripperger. That's what I know of. I'm sure there are plenty more out there, but he's a good source on the virtues and the vices. And he has great definitions for all of them, which would take too long to do now. But I would recommend listening to that. But also, these, if you probably know what most of them are, and so you can look them up. This is just a guidepost. You can look them up, see what talks are, see how St. Thomas talks about these virtues. There are different versions of the Summa, but these are excellent. This is an excellent chart to get into, to really find out what is it that I need work on. And it's during Advent, so it's a perfect time to work on it. It's the second perfect time to work on it, the first one being Lent. But it's never a bad time during the year to work on our imperfections. But so how do we get these little packets of virtue? If we get prudence, we get that packet with it. If we get justice, we get that packet of virtues with it, which is kind of cool. But we get those through, as I mentioned, every virtuous act and prayer. These are infused virtues, not acquired virtues. These are infused virtues. They must be attained by prayer. And then we get to the qualities of a virtue on page 416, the qualities of a virtue that we're striving for. As I mentioned, number one, a single good act is not a virtue. It must become habitual. Virtues are natural or supernatural depending on the intention. The intention. A virtue might not actually be meritorious if it's not done for the right intention. Virtues and virtuous acts are meritorious only when supernatural, and only supernatural virtues merit eternal happiness in heaven. Our place in heaven is only increased by supernatural virtue. So this is our framework. The secret of success in life is not what we know. It's great to have that piece of paper. Photocopy that when you get home, put it on one piece of paper, fold in your pocket, and life doesn't change. Well, that was useless. So we have to make sure we practice at least one thing when we go home from this talk tonight. Then we get to the opposite, the vices. And there's a little statue for each of the vices. Usually, if you do it pride, avarice, lust, anger, gluttony, envy, sloth, then it's pelages. You could also do it pelages or plages this way. But these are not actually sins in and of themselves. They are the source of sin. We all have them. And we have one in particular that we're always fighting. But I just want to point this out. At the bottom is the website for this. This is not, I did not make that. But it was great. It was perfect. So I'm using it thanks to that priest. I believe it was Benedictine. But anyway, that priest made this. So I will be using his slides, and the slides after this will be from the same source, and they point out all the little shortcomings that fall under our particular weakness for the 7 capital sins. It's important to realize for us, and as we train our children, that these tendencies are good in and of themselves because they're placed there by God. But it's the misuse of them for something not for a particular good, but a disorder of them for an earthly good, that is a vice. So these tendencies are good, but they have to be controlled. We all have concupiscence, so we all must realize that we have the natural tendency to misuse them. And vice, like virtue, is habitual. If I will add a few details, but if you look at another chart on page 423, there's a good reference for you as we explore the 7 capital sins or vices. So, for the first one is pride. It's what's called the capital sin. It's the head of all sin. Every sin essentially is a sin of pride, and there are a few ways to practice pride that we want to avoid. Here on the board here. We prefer our own desires to God's desire. That just sounds wrong. We know it's wrong, but we do it. We seek our own excellence inordinately, proud of our talents, beauty, accomplishments, possessions, whatever it is that we're proud of. There is something they do mention where ambition and self-respect, if ordered to becoming better in what God wants us to do, and being respectful for ourselves and for each other as Christians, that's a virtue. But being proud of it because we did it and we have it, that's the vice. Again, all falls back on intention. So that is pride, and it leads to these other side habits, traits that we should avoid. And as we know, the opposite virtue is humility. Humility leads one to have a just opinion of oneself and to give all the credit for gifts and success to God. Now I know it's kind of I'm going to take a sports example. It's not the most religious example, but it is what it illustrates what our internal thought should be. Some sports players, after they do something significant in their particular sport, I'm thinking mostly of baseball and basketball, but they point upward after they've done something good. Whether I know sometimes people do that, and it's kind of, I think, overused, and maybe the intention isn't there. We're not sure, but we do want that action for everything we do. All our heart and words and actions must be given to God. And if everything is directed to God, we are practicing humility. It's not abasing ourselves super low. It is just taking the station that God has given us, whether it's high or low. That's humility. And it's very important to practice it. Covetousness. And as we go through these vices, explore these vices, it's important to think of what are the consequences in my life, and what are the consequences of my vice, we all have them, on society around me. We don't have time to get into all of that for each particular vice, but it's a good examination for each one of us individually. We have avarice, also known in your book as covetousness. And a famous example this time of year would be Scrooge, visited by Jacob Marley. And covetousness, an excessive love of and desire for worldly goods and possessions. And it leads to these particular vices. And these are only some of them. Others are spoken of in your book. But this excessive attachment to earthly things is very misleading. And it not only makes our actions not meritorious, but it also warps our brain, warps our mind to seeking only the things of earth. Anytime we become attached to them, our intention becomes completely turned around, and none of our we start getting the habit of none of our actions become meritorious. So we can't be like hard of heart, but we also can't be recklessly extravagant with everything we have. So there's as Aristotle points out, virtue is the mean between excesses. So that is the virtue of liberality is the opposite of avarice, and it inclines a person to give freely of his time, money, and talents to worthy purposes. That's the opposite of avarice. Not giving out everything, but giving of what you have for good purposes. Lust. There are plenty of side issues with this particular vice, but it is an abominable vice, consisting in an inordinate liking for, seeking, or indulgence in pleasures of the flesh. Why is it called abominable? Because it creates a human being into an animal. We are following animal passions, animal tendencies. We are no longer, this vice, most vices do, but this one in particular, dulls the brain. And science has actually shown this more recently in the studies they've done. It actually dulls the brain and almost cannot be reversed later in life. That's why these sins against, and there's more, but these sins against the virtue of purity, as well as modesty, and these vices are so damaging to people, not just physically and spiritually, but also mentally. So it's one that is very prominent in today's society, and one that must be avoided. And in order to keep ourselves pure, that is the best way to attack this vice, by not attacking it. All other six, you can attack those temptations head on, revisit them, and push them away. It's like a spiritual bicep curl. This one we cannot. The best plan of action for this particular vice is to run, and then prayer and the sacraments. Okay, we can't play with it. And too many people, good-willed people too, say, that's fine. What I'm doing, what they're doing, what my kids are doing, that'll work out. No, it's It's very dangerous. We must understand we were born with concupiscence, and those tendencies must be channeled in the right direction. Not just let loose, channeled. And we're the channels for the children that we have. Anger is a disordered desire for vengeance. A disordered desire for vengeance. God did have a desire for vengeance, but God can do that. Ours is disordered if it leads us to break away from God. It is a result of uncontrolled selfishness, and it leads to the things spoken of on the board and also in your book. We must practice meekness, mildness, and patience to get over it in our dealings with ourselves, in our dealings with our neighbors. It's very, very important. And part of meekness and patience is something perfect for Advent, is sacrifice. Make some sacrifices, mortify ourselves so that we can overcome this. The next one, gluttony, is actually, it's an inordinate liking for and an inordinate use of food and drink. And this one actually is ordinarily a venial sin. And as I tell the teenagers, it's pretty hard for some people to commit a serious sin of gluttony, besides obviously the abuse of substances. That would lead to mortal sin. But overeating, the obvious one of overeating food and drink, is ordinarily a venial sin. It's when we lose the sense of reason through drugs, alcohol, or something else, that it becomes a mortal sin because we've given up our gift of free will. Must practice moderation and temperance in order to overcome this, as you well know. This one is interesting. Envy. Envy is a discontent or uneasiness arising from the knowledge of another's excellence or good fortune, accompanied with some degree of hatred and a desire to possess equal advantages. It is the one sin, it's unique, it's the one sin that does not seek good. Every other sin desires some form of good, how we see good. This is the only sin that is displeased when we see good. So it's a very malicious vice to acquire, and hopefully it's nothing that any of us can relate to, but it is something, and it has to be opposed by brotherly love, charity. Because it is so malicious, charity, the opposite virtue, is very powerful against this sin of envy with these others. Usually venial sins, but they can, if they're serious enough, if the matter and intent is serious enough, these can lead to mortal sins. And then last one, sloth. The animal vice. So sloth is a distaste for spiritual things, a laziness, or an unwillingness to strive for them because of the labor required. It is a sin against charity because it is a sin against the love we owe to God. We are holding back from giving someone who deserves all our love something he deserves. So it's not just the animal that hangs on a tree. It can be one that creeps into our day-to-day life very easily, because naturally we love taking it easy. And that includes every single person in this room, myself included. So tomorrow's a day off from school. So that leads to, we have to make sure we just use our time well. Obviously we're going to get to recreation and the third commandment at the end of this talk. But this vice hinders accomplishments and makes us almost useless in the way we do things and in what we stop doing. So we become a burden to ourselves and to society by this weird vice. Diligence is the virtue opposed to it, and it is the devoted care given to a particular task. There are so many benefits, physical, spiritual, and mental, so many benefits to just focusing on what you're doing right now. It's more memorable. It's also more meritorious when done in the state of sanctifying grace. So it also helps overcome sloth. Now, to overcome these vices, on page 424, it points out the predominant fault. There is one of these is something we're all attached to. Now, I don't know if you can read the black one, but hopefully you can read the vice with the opposing virtue. But we all have one we're most attracted to. Satan knows that. And if you've had a chance to read the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis, the devils have been practicing for thousands of years on attacking you on your particular vice, that particular weakness. If they can attack you on that weakness, they'll drag you down to hell very easily. If we overcome that weakness through prayer, then it is much harder for the devil to drag us down by any other vice. Any other vice. That's the general. If we can succeed with the general, we win. If the general is taken by the enemy, we lose. And Satan knows that. So, one way to overcome this predominant fault, as it mentions, is your morning and night prayers. In the morning, thank God for preserving us through the night, but give ourselves over to God and ask for help in that particular virtue. And then at night, make an examination of that particular vice in order to see, okay, did I fail or did I strengthen myself? Don't be afraid to make an examination of conscience on where you strengthened yourself. It's always a good thing to have some positives in our day-to-day life. We're always good at being negative about things, so it's always good to have some positive things too. So, what are these acts that lead to these vices? Sin. Sin. We know what sin is, but there are a couple definitions that we should know, at least in part, on page 425. It is an act of the will by which we turn from God. An act of the will by which we do what? We disorder ourselves by turning away from God. Our true end, our order, and we choose created thing over eternal goodness and love. If we explain it that way, it's like, oh, why would we ever do that? Well, we're born with original sin, so it's pretty easy. And it is an offense against the law of God, and any willful thought, word, deed, or omission, that's the tough one, forbidden by the law of God. So there's 4 ways that it is so hateful to God, or 4 reasons why it's so bad on 425, which is a great list for us to keep in mind. It degrades us, it strengthens concupiscence, and weakens virtue. And that is what an animal can do, not what a human can do. We feel a sense of shame every time we commit it, and if we don't, it means we've dulled that sense. It is the greatest of evils because it is an offense against an infinite being. War is terrible, as we know, but it doesn't kill an infinite being. Sin offends an infinite being. It is an insult to the thrice holy God, meaning that mysterious, mystical, all-loving, divine being who created us and was perfectly happy without us is the one we offended. And it is an ingratitude of the blackest kind. So there are a couple kinds of sin. Original sin is the one we were born with through Adam. Because he is the head of the human race, he can't give what he doesn't have. So if he doesn't have a state of grace, he can't give it. So that's why we're all born with original sin. And so that's taken away through baptism. And without baptism, we can't get rid of it. And then there is actual sin, which is any personal sin that we ourselves committed by our own act. Now, those things we know. But on page 426, it says, what are those actual sins? They are sins of thought, sins of desire, sins of words, of deeds, and omissions. It's very important for us to overcome the vices. Do we think of those 5 categories? Thought, desire, word, deed, omission. So that's why it's important when we make our nightly examination to focus on one particular thing, a particular examine it's called, because there are so many angles to look at it in which to, another sports reference. So in the major leagues, whatever particular professional sport, they study, there was a I know there was a particular example of when the Red Sox won the World Series in 2004, 2007. There's a particular catcher they had, and he would go to the stadium 3 hours before every game. And he'd study, because he's the catcher, he'd study the batters he's opposing, and then as a batter, he'd study the pitcher he's facing, and study their tendencies, study their weaknesses. And that's how he would be able to help the pitcher, by the call signs that he'd give to the pitcher from behind the plate. And that's how he became a successful catcher. But pros do that. They break down their game to almost an annoying degree. Kobe Bryant would shoot 1,000 shots from a particular angle with a particular footwork before the shot every day. And he was so crazy about making it perfect that it became almost an insanity to be with him. But that's how we should approach our spiritual life, where these sins, this predominant fault that we just talked about, has to be rooted out with that professional proficiency that these guys use to make millions of dollars. That's going to be gone when they die anyway. So that's one example we can take from them. There aren't too many more. But there are the degrees of these sins. Obviously, we know there are mortal and venial. But mortal, yes, is a grievous offense against the law of God. But we must remember it kills the supernatural life of the soul. The soul is still in us, so it doesn't kill the natural life of the soul. It kills the supernatural life of the soul. And we just learned that without the supernatural life, we're dead in the water. Nothing we do is meritorious. Nothing. So it's useless. So we have to make sure we're in the state of grace. Now, there are 3 conditions we must know in order to commit a mortal sin, in order to avoid the mortal sin. But it has to be serious matter. We know this, but there are a couple of fine details we must also know. Serious matter, full knowledge, and full consent of the will. So serious matter, it has to be very serious. Now, is it what we omit or what we do? Both of those situations have to be serious. So that's the more obvious one. Reason and church tell us which one is serious or not so serious. But full knowledge has an interesting twist to it, I think. We know it's wrong, and we think that the act we're doing is wrong, and then we do it anyway. That's the third thing. But it is enough that we have a general idea of its evilness. We don't need to know its specific evil results in the plan of God, in the plan of human creation. It just has to have a general knowledge, and that's sufficient to be a mortal sin. Also, if we think it's serious, and it ends up not being serious, it's still a mortal sin, because we willingly committed something, what we thought was serious. So that intent makes it a mortal sin. And then obviously full consent of the will. A half asleep, insane, you have to, those people do not commit mortal sins. It has to be full consent of the will. Full consent of the will can be done before the action is done. So we can't commit a mortal sin before we actually do anything. The mortal sin happens before we do the action. The action is just a fulfillment of the mortal sin we already committed. Those three things for a mortal sin are all up here. Venial, it's serious enough. How serious is mortal sin? It's the reason why the angels were thrown out of heaven after one. It is the reason why we are all born with original sin after Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Paradise for one of them. It is the reason why we all must be baptized in order to get to heaven, and because of Adam's sin. And God created the creation He loves most, because His Son became one of us. Mankind, every single one of them is created with original sin. That's how serious mortal sin is. Venial sin is also a very great evil, greater than any natural evil, but it's called venial because it just means pardoned. It can be more easily pardoned. The number of venial sins never equal a mortal, we know that, but the evils of venial sin are pointed out on page 428. It's still an offense against the infinite loving God. Yes, it's the greatest evil next to mortal sin, but also it's like that vice. It lessens the degree of love in our souls, so our actions don't become as meritorious. Every venial sin weakens that love. So every positive and negative action we have matters. And it weakens the will, prepares the way for mortal sin. There's an example in the Old Testament of the one we all know in Genesis 19, Lot's wife. As Sodom and Gomorrah are getting destroyed, they're running away. Lot has his wife and his 2 daughters with him. He said, don't turn around. She's curious, not mortal sin, but she just turns around. And she's turned to a pillar of salt in that instant and judged by God in that instant. That's a venial sin. There's the interesting one there too is Uzzah touching the ark as David is bringing in the ark towards the temple. Then it's drawn by a pair of oxen, and as the oxen come in, they hit a rut, and the cart starts sliding, and the ark starts sliding off. And so Uzzah goes up to save it, and as soon as he touches it, he's struck dead. That was a pretty good deed on his part, wasn't it? No, God said no one, except the Levites who he ordained are supposed to touch the Ark of the Covenant. Doesn't matter what your intention was. God said that you're not to touch the Ark. So that wasn't a serious sin, but it was serious enough. It was still a sin. It was a venial sin, so therefore punishable by God, and he struck him dead instantly. So that is it seems like, that didn't seem too serious. That's the 3-letter word. It's still a sin. It's still a disobedience against what God said. We try to excuse ourselves in so many ways. So there are imperfections too, lesser than venial sins. They aren't even sins, but there are imperfections that lead to venial sins, that lead to mortal sins. Those, if we have, it's like, I might commit a few of those. I'll get over them sometime. If we have a lackadaisical attitude towards those too, it's also a sign that we're spiritually weak. So we try to overcome those as well. We don't look for ways to get by in the spiritual life. If we try to just get by, we might make it to purgatory. That's not the goal. We want to try to see how much can I do for God. And the motive should be, how can I give back to someone who's given so much? So if we look at the last part of our exploration today, not the short part, but the second half, let's say, is the first 3 commandments. And so just on page 430 to page 431, the Decalogue, 10 commandments, there's an important paragraph there. You already know the 10 commandments. So it will just focus on one particular paragraph there. Why? Why do we obey the Decalogue? It's on page 431, the biggest paragraph there. Because sin, the violation of God's commandment, creates disorder. Disorder. Where people are disengaged from where they're supposed to be going. That's never good for anybody. And the cause of all evil. Sin is accompanied by remorse of conscience, which we already talked about. So, it is important that we get rid of this sin because obedience, as we mentioned at the beginning, gives greater glory to God, but also is the source of our happiness. Source of our happiness. And that is significant, not because we all want to be bubbly happy every day. Some days it's very difficult. But we all have to at least strive for that happiness because that's a little gift placed inside us by God to solidify the intention we have of pleasing Him. That feeling isn't bad, we just don't go by it. But that feeling is a guidepost for us. All right, so each commandment, now we go to the road of law. Virtue and vice is that striving for perfect virtue is the road of love. Now these are the basics. The first 3 commandments are duties towards God. This is the road of law. It gives us, this book here gives us ways to please God and and it also gives us ways to separate ourselves from Him, which we don't want to do. And these are great examinations of consciences. These ideas here. I also printed out an examination of conscience for everybody, so after the lecture, I won't be using it for this talk, but you're welcome to take one on the table there. It's actually a good, solid 9-pager put together by Father Ripperger. So it's very detailed, and I would recommend not being too overdaunted. It's a page folded in half, so you can count it as like 5 actual pages. But it's a very detailed list. It is made for adults, so if you'd like to share it with younger people, he did change up the 6th and 9th commandment version. He also, on his website, he has one for younger kids for that particular vice. So you're welcome to take one afterwards. Those of you who are watching, if you would like one, I can email it to you if you let me know. All right, so the first commandment. Now, for each of the 3 commandments, I'm going to read, and it's in your book, at page 433, what the whole thing says. Because those words given by God in the terror of Mount Sinai are significant. I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that place of slavery. You shall not have other gods besides me. You shall not carve idols for yourselves in the shape of anything in the sky above or on the earth below or in the waters beneath the earth. You shall not bow down before them to worship them. Solemn words, and the Israelites were terrified when they heard God's voice. But it instilled in them a holy fear of God to obey them. It indicates that he is very serious about what he's saying. He doesn't joke about these things. But it also should give us a sense of gratitude because he says, I am the one who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Thank you. So there's a sense of gratitude in owing something back to God because of the way he phrased this first commandment. What the first commandment prescribes. So these are good check marks for us to see if we're obeying the first 3 commandments. The sins against the first 3 commandments are the most severe sins we can commit. The most frequently committed ones, Our Lady of Fatima told us, are the 6th and 9th commandment. But these are the most serious ones. So we want to see what it tells us to do and what it tells us to avoid. First commandment, first and foremost, tells us to adore God, which means we acknowledge him. Yes, we know we acknowledge him as our supreme being, our dependence on him, but we must give him worship. We don't follow the line that we're spiritual, not religious. Any religion demands worship. And I tell the students, even the Aztecs knew that. Even they had a very warped sense of sacrifice. But every religion demands sacrifice and worship. So first of all, that comes from practicing the 3 theological virtues. We know faith. That was our study at the beginning of the book. Charity, we've covered in greater detail recently. But it tells us a little bit about hope. That's covered in a later book. But hope is the supernatural. So the virtue of hope is specified on page 434. And we'll have to wrap this up. Let's see. I should be able to say yes. All right. Add time. And just do that just in case. Okay. So the practice faith, hope, and charity. Those are specified on page 434. And the virtue of religion has 3 parts to it. The practice of adoration, lifting the mind and the heart to God in all that we do. First of all, it's interior and exterior. Jews had that in the Old Testament. They focus on the exterior. But we do it at Mass interiorly and exteriorly. And these 4 things here, the 4 levels of worship and veneration, only God gets worship, but we can tell the Protestants this is what we give to Mary and the saints. Those are different. That's veneration. Like we venerate images of our loved ones and we hold them dear to our hearts. We hold these successors in life and in death dear to our hearts. Relics, we hold them in close to our hearts, and it is a practice of the virtue of religion to honor them because of the sacrifice that they made. The practice of the virtue of religion also demands sacrifice for adoring God, thanking God, asking God for favors, and saying we're sorry to God. Those are the four ends of our sacrifices, the four ends of the Mass. And we know the value of the, well, no, we don't know the value of the Mass. We have heard the value of the Mass before, and we'll get into more detail in another book. Prayer is very important in our day-to-day life, and it is, every single prayer we have is a practice of the virtue of religion. And it should be done daily, consistently, and there are 6 ways, 6 dispositions we should have when we pray. And they're listed on 442 to 443. But it's avoiding distractions, with attention, humility, with faith and confidence, resignation to God's will, and finally perseverance. St. Alphonsus said that he who prays is saved. He who does not pray is damned. That's how important prayer is. Simple as that. Thank you, St. Alphonsus. All right, and then the first commandment forbids sins against faith, and those are sins against the theological virtues and sins against the virtue of religion. And those can be seen on 446 to 447. But one that they mention against faith is indifferentism, thinking that one religion is as good as another. It hurts our faith, and it doesn't help anybody get to heaven. So it's something that we must fix in ourselves and in others. The sins against religion, I'll mention briefly, are sacrilege, simony, 449, idolatry, divination, black magic, witchcraft, and superstition. More of those, some of those are in are kind of in past. Some of those are not involved in our day-to-day life. But idolatry, worshiping wealth and power, is definitely a part of our world today. So something that we can still avoid. The second commandment on page 453, we know what that pertains to, but this reverence for God's name and all things related to God is very important in not only strengthening our spiritual life, but also the spiritual lives of others. But the misuse and the proper use of language is a very important part of this to understand. So oaths, or yes, calling God to witness to an action that we're doing is extremely significant. So if we call God to witness a lie, it is a very serious sin. It's okay to call God to a witness of something that's true. And if it's true, if it's just, it is a good oath. But if it's false, it is something that must be avoided at all costs because it is a very serious sin. The religious vows, a vow of promising to do something for God, are spoken of, we know, in religious profession we make them, but it's promising to do something for God. If we vow to do something unlawful, that is a sin, and going through with it is a sin. Very serious sins. Third commandment, on page 460, it is a pretty obvious one, but it is something that is, there is a part of it that is not as well understood as it should be, and that is what it forbids. We know that we worship on Sunday because of the resurrection, but also on Sunday we must make sure that we keep the day holy by avoiding servile work. And servus meaning slave, so any work that used to be done by slaves, manual work. Avoiding manual work. If it's necessary or for the good of others, it can be done with a dispensation by the priest. You ask a priest if that's all right, and he'll give you the yes or no on it. And we glorify God by that sacrifice of not doing something that we would like to do because it's servile work. Recreation is fine. And it's part of our keeping the Lord's Day holy, getting our bodies ready for the week. But prayer and sacrifice, yes, and relaxing the body to strengthen it for